Yaroslav Bashku, head of the Center for Political Research Doctrine, is with us today. Yaroslav, I'm very glad to see you. Welcome.
Good evening. Hello. And
So let's talk then. Yes, well, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sibiga, rightly pointed out about the threat from Iran and the Russian Federation. But still, on the other hand, right now, I wouldn't really want you to, yes, just go ahead and argue that point. It's unclear right now what the relationship is between Iran and the Russian Federation, yes. Sibiga says that obviously the regimes in Moscow and Tehran are inseparable. They work together and continue to exchange resources, weapons, and technologies. Yes, and of course this poses a threat to a number of countries, but on the other hand, Russia is in no hurry to help Iran right now. Perhaps they know, or rather, to put it more accurately, perhaps they're taking a pause. I don't know. Maybe there are some other restraining factors. Maybe it's what's happening with oil. Today, it really plays directly into the hands of the Russian Federation itself. But still, yes, there's this story that supposedly they continue to synchronize certain processes, both in the Russian Federation and in Iran. But on the other hand, Russia is not in a hurry to help Iran.
well, we have to understand that the interaction between Iran and Russia, despite all these loyal declarations and the apparent willingness to take serious steps, has always been expressed in rather limited forms of cooperation. That is, yes, there have been unprecedented steps in the transfer of military technologies. Again, Iran does not give the Shahed technology to just anyone. It should be understood that the fact that Russia was able to implement essentially the Iranian military-industrial complex project on its own territory is a sign of high trust. But Russia itself firstly has a serious problem. It is waging a war that is, let's say, much more exhausting, depleting, and requires constant supplies of air defense components. Again, there are serious problems with spare parts for aircraft and so on. In other words, the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine requires a huge amount of consumables every day, and we can't say that they have a lot of surplus there. The Russians might have had some reserves tucked away. That is, the production in the Russian Federation is already operating at the only capacity possible in this situation, with maximum concentration of resources. Even with tax increases and the creation of other elements of economic militarization, Russia still can't manage it. So this idea that Russia can just give away or even sell a lot of what is needed to someone else is not realistic at the moment. That's why I think Russia is prioritizing first and foremost its own supplies and its own military operations. Secondly, to some extent, Russia benefits from the closure of the Hormuz Strait. Indeed, because this gives Russia the opportunity, for example, to say, you didn't want to lift sanctions on our oil? Well then, buy oil at $120 per barrel, or something along those lines. And for Russians, the situation with the conflict in the Middle East is advantageous. That is, we can't call it beneficial, for example, for Iran. We can't exactly call it beneficial even for the US and Israel, for whom this is a forced measure. It's definitely not beneficial for China, whose industry is closely tied to the price of oil, and ideally, that oil would be cheaper. But Russia, on the other hand, benefits precisely from the very fact of hostilities and the closure of the Hormuz Strait. Let's put it this way. For now, Russia can afford not to intervene in this situation. Besides all that, the alliance commitments between Russia and Iran did not involve any specific concrete actions. And Russia, let's say, doesn't have any spare troops or available resources from its military industry to provide Iran, for example, with the kind of support they once gave to Assad in Syria. There simply aren't any free hands for that now. I think the Iranian leadership was told a long time ago, they've long been aware that if a major conflict breaks out, everyone will be on their own. It's clear that Russia is providing intelligence as reported by the American press. Perhaps some individual components are being supplied under small contracts, but one way or another, Iran really is left alone. And for them, this whole story, so to speak, is their personal struggle for the survival of the regime. Nothing more, nothing less. In other words, they don't believe, let's put it this way, they no longer expect any help from Russia. First of all, I think they look at this aspect quite realistically. Secondly, I wouldn't rule out that the Russians themselves told them this during negotiations that, well, in case something happens, we can provide this or that, but don't count on us too much. So now Iran is acting like a country that relies only on itself, fully understanding that the survival of the regime is probably not beneficial. In the long term, it's not beneficial for anyone. Why? Because China is interested in getting cheap oil again. All the neighbors in the Persian Gulf are interested in unblocking the strait so that oil can be sold. The US and Israel are interested in denuclearizing Iran, stopping its nuclear program, and pulling it out of Russia's sphere of influence. That's why a rather serious coalition is forming against Iran. And if even Europe, even Macron, today announced that they will participate in this and will try to unblock the Strait of Hormuz by force with their ships. This still shows that Iran remains isolated, and it's unlikely that anyone will seriously join its side. Iran does have local allies. These are the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and partially in the Gaza Strip. But all of these are players who, frankly speaking, are not at the state level. These are players whom Iran itself has supplied with weapons, as well as with various instructors and recommendations, including precisely for situations like this, to have levers of influence in the region, not only within its own territory. And now it will use them first and foremost.
Let's talk about some prospects. Maybe not too distant, but still. After the operation in Iran is completed, the world will become safer. This was stated by the US Secretary of State. He called Iran the main state sponsor of terrorism in the world. According to Rubio, the main goal of the operation being conducted by the United States and its partners is to weaken Tehran's missile capabilities. Let's listen to the direct speech and discuss.
We can all now see the threat that this Ayatollah regime poses to the region and to the world. They are trying to hold the world hostage. They attack their neighbors. They attack neighboring countries. They target energy infrastructure and civilians. They attack embassies. This is a terrorist government. This is a terrorist regime, and we see how they terrorize the state using weapons such as missiles and one-way attack drones. The goal of our mission is to deprive them of the ability to continue doing this.
Yaroslav, well, it should be said that just recently a rather hysterical interview appeared with Kremlin Press Secretary Peskov, who noted that we have all lost what we call international law. To be honest, right now, I don't even understand how anyone can call on others to observe the norms and principles of international law. In fact, it no longer exists. Yes, Jura, it exists, but de facto it no longer does. And what law has replaced international law? It's unlikely anyone can articulate that right now. And this is despite the fact that in 2022, in 2014, in the Kremlin, they didn't mention international law at all, not even once. What do you think this hysteria that by and large Peskov broadcasted? Surely it must have originated in the innermost sanctum of the Kremlin, feeling that most likely the dictator, will Putin be the next to fall after a series of regimes have collapsed recently? What do you think?
Well, by the way, this doesn't contradict the things Russia said in the Hall of Columns when it seized Crimea in 2014, and everything else as well. This is just a continuation of that strategy. So look, first Russia, in the most blatant way, violating international law, sends troops into Ukraine, seizes Crimea and Donbass. Then in 2022, it launches large-scale military operations in other regions as well. Yes. And after that, the Russian Federation starts this kind of rhetoric like, let's de-escalate, but let's forget about international law. Why? Because, well, they've already bypassed international law, seized a bunch of territories, already committed a lot of crimes that have nothing to do with international law. And so after all that, they're like, let's de-escalate, for example, international law. Well, that's no longer relevant. There's nothing more to say. That's it. And they're counting on a scenario where the West will eventually make peace with them, but on their terms. That is, okay, we'll just let you keep what you've stolen, and international law, well, yes, it's dead. Well, then we'll just have to come up with some kind of new one. And as for what we stole during the transition period, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, and so on, and so forth. So let's just forget about all of that. Basically, you see, this is a scheme to legalize what's been stolen. A mental one, it's a kind of mental gymnastics. This is what Russia is trying to implement. It absolutely matches its activities in the cognitive domain, in the information sphere, in what Russia is promoting in the West. So this is part of a larger subsystem. This is truly Russia's intention, to change the order and the rules in the world, and not even in favor of the law of the strong. Usually I want to emphasize that, because under the law of the strong, if it becomes a universal rule, Russia could lose. That is, if the West accepts for itself the principle that the law of the strong now operates as the main and irreplaceable rule, then much more serious measures will be taken against Russia. In that case, The only thing still restraining the West from more radical actions is this. Again, it's the same story about what they want to preserve. This international law, or at least the illusion of it, yes, the factor of its presence. If the West truly adopts the law of the strong, then let's say the first victim or one of the first victims, that will be precisely the current Russian regime. The Russian authorities are in favor of establishing some other kind of law, but one in which the stolen goods remain with those who organized it, just so that... Why not? Well, let's just forget about all the crimes for the sake of peace, which in fact is what they used to do before. So this isn't the first time this has happened. The Soviet Union once occupied the Baltic states, yes, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and seized vast territories from other countries. And for a long time, the West did not recognize this. But later, Russia managed to legalize its borders. In 1972, the Soviet Union was able to legalize this in Helsinki, yes, to achieve such de-escalation and just live peacefully. So their goal is to repeat that act. They are not ready for a long-term confrontation with the West on the principle of every man for himself to the bitter end. No, I mean, everything they've done up to this point has been a bluff.
All right, Yaroslav, if you spoke this well, I was taking notes, I'll be honest. So what measures then? You say more serious measures. At what point, that's what I want to ask, and how might this right of the strong from the West look in relation to the Russian Federation?
Well, first of all, one way or another, no one will be restrained by the factor of state borders.
About it.
Can then be forgotten. And in today's realities, why? Let's put it this way. Why do Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates throw drones at each other, carry out strikes in other ways, but it doesn't escalate into some kind of major war? There are still, let's say, some restraining mechanisms between them in the form of simply not wanting to go to war. But they can still make each other's lives difficult. And if the same rule starts to apply in Europe, the overall balance could shift very quickly, not in Russia's favor. Yes, Europe currently has problems with the number of missiles and the number of strike drones, but the main thing is that Europe has industry and an economy. And if there is the necessary political will, let's say the ability to make life difficult for Russia for every wrong word spoken, the Europeans, the European component of NATO, will have that capability. And if Russia doesn't negotiate some new de-escalation framework for itself, then it will find itself in a situation where, let's put it this way, just beyond its wall, beyond its border, it's not just some single enemy like Ukraine, but a whole bunch of such enemies united together. Some interregional agreements like the Baltic countries or the Scandinavian countries, among themselves ready to even go for certain provocations. To be the first just to stir up the entire West. And this is exactly what the Russians would not want to see happening in other areas. You see, when Finland joined NATO, the Russians couldn't do anything at all. They couldn't even properly threaten or escalate against it. That's the catch, you see. But
here's something interesting. I'd like to hear your opinion on this. There is already information that the main Kremlin bandit has congratulated the new Ayatollah and promised support and solidarity to the new leadership of Iran. But what's interesting is that considering the United States and Trump personally have stated that they will not accept such leadership in Iran, it's quite possible that on a larger scale, he may end up sharing the fate of his father at any moment in any case. But what's interesting is, in your opinion, how could this situation be resolved? This situation initiated by the United States and in Israel, an operation called Epic Fury, Roaring Lion. Considering that Iraqi officially stated in an interview with NBC News that there is a close partnership with Russia, but he categorically rejected the possibility of a truce with Israel or the United States. So in your honest opinion, in what way could all this end?
well, one way or another, the US would prefer limited operations. That is, they would like limited, swift actions, as they always do, in fact. They want everything to be quick, cheap, and very successful. Just like in Venezuela, they flew in, shot, finished everything in 40 minutes, and left. But it's clear that Iran does not allow for such an opportunity. This is a country with rather serious capabilities in the field of defense, a fairly creative Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and, let's say, significant achievements in the military-industrial complex with reserves and the ability to survive in isolation. I think the main bet for the Americans is that as soon as they realize the military components are stagnating, they will start winding it down. And everything will remain in this kind of uncertain state, but then the Americans will intensify their efforts in the intelligence and cognitive domain, trying more and more to spur the Iranian people themselves into action against the Islamist regime, because there is a great deal of discontent there. And not so long ago, protests in Iran were suppressed very harshly. And let's put it this way, it's very difficult to judge the number of victims, but we understand that it's a huge figure, an enormous number. We're talking about thousands and thousands of black body bags. And in this situation, so to speak, the US needs to decide for itself what ultimately carries fewer risks and brings them closer to their goal. Either they are betting on internal processes in Iran, which may not start quickly, or they will continue to get more and more involved in direct combat, considering, among other things, a ground operation as a necessary component, including that. Because Western media have started talking about this, I tend to think that the US still will not carry it out. Well, at least for now, it looks more like a hypothetical scenario. But more likely, in this round, both sides will walk away with nothing, intending to return to the conflict a bit later.
Trump said, yes, that for now, the White House is not talking about or preparing for a ground operation, just to sum it up briefly. In context, you mentioned and recalled all his words, but at the same time, yes, today the situation is one way, tomorrow it could be different. So, Yaroslav, as you were speaking just now, I would just like to make a brief interim summary. So, at this stage, you don't see, let's say, a definite solution as to how the U.S. military operation in Iran might end, right? I mean, the goals of the states, yes, regarding, say, regime change and so on and so forth. Although Trump, sometimes he says regime change, now he says that's not the main goal. So once again, I want to hear from you. How do you see it? At what point will this military operation stop?
I think it will stop, not because any particular goals have been achieved, because to achieve goals such as overthrowing the regime or changing its political configuration, a ground operation is needed. And apparently the Americans are not ready for that yet. It takes a long time to prepare for it. It's not tens of thousands of soldiers, it's actually much more than that. It's something comparable in scale to the war in Iraq. And even if such a situation arises, let's put it that way, it still takes a lot of time. Therefore, one way or another, the US will now be looking for a balance between a political solution, that is, waiting for an uprising in Iran, or continuing to act while their own resources are being depleted. Ammunition supply, because missiles also run out at such a rate of strikes. Or, to put it another way, to keep waiting for some new pretext. But in reality, we don't actually see, let's say, any guarantee that this conflict will end in any way. Right now, that is, yes, the sides may stop carrying out strikes, but that doesn't mean the conflict is over. It just means they've retreated to their corners to regain strength, and it could flare up again in 6 months or a year easily. The main cause of the conflict remains unresolved. Therefore, let's put it this way, I am more inclined to believe that at this moment there will be no resolution, but perhaps there could be a cessation of hostilities.
Here's something interesting. The same call that was made the other day by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the people of Iran should rise up against the current regime and free themselves from tyranny. Actually, these protest sentiments do exist among Iranians at the moment. But will they continue to a sufficient extent and degree for the Iranian people to actually have the opportunity to restart the system, essentially to restart their own destiny? Or is a return to what was before, again before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, already impossible?
No, why? Well, it's quite possible. Iran is actually a fairly secular society. That is, it's a country with a rather high percentage of urban population, and if you look at the urban youth, they don't wear hijabs there. They dress there not much differently from, for example, how young people in Istanbul dress now, or something similar. In other words, this is a society that already knows what universities are. Many of them have been to the West. Yes, of course, there are problems with access to the Western internet, but nevertheless, a huge number of people have already seen the West firsthand. So it's kind of like the late Soviet Union, you could say, where many people have already traveled, brought back chewing gum, jeans, and all that sort of thing. An Iranian society, let's put it this way, especially the youth, does not consider the Ayatollahs or the Islamic Revolution to be something very relevant or about them. In other words, they don't associate themselves with it. But the very fact of military actions makes it more difficult for protests to continue right now because, let's say, engaging in political or protest activity under such a military threat when missiles are flying at government buildings and could fall on anyone in the street is, to put it mildly, difficult. Therefore, most likely we might see, perhaps, a new outcome of the protest in Iran. If the fighting dies down now, it won't happen immediately. Some kind of superficial stabilization of the situation is needed so that people can shift in their minds from concerns about their own safety back to thinking about the future. Why are we all gathered here, and what do we want from our country, from our future? For that, time is needed as well as a somewhat safer situation.
Yaroslav, thanks for joining us. There's much more to discuss. We'll definitely continue our conversation. Yaroslav Bashku, head of the Doctrine Center, was with us today remotely.